All right, here's the third and final chapter of lecture 11. We're going to talk about JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is the new hot and awesome way to transmit data across the internet, preferred data format. XML, I believe, is still technically the dominant data exchange format, but that is only due to legacy systems. It is being left behind in the dust by JSON, and I'm not sure if that number is still true or not, if XML still is winning, but any time in the future, JSON will eventually take over and win. So it's the preferred data exchange format, the thing to know, thing to love, thing to learn, etc. So once again, we have a few links. First one is JSON lint, and I use this all the time for validating JSON. So anytime you need to type up some JSON, you want to make sure it's validated, boom, use JSON lint. It's a website. If you are using Sublime Text does have plugins for JSON validation. I recommend using that as well. In addition, we have another Mozilla tutorial. Once again, fantastic, good to use. And then if you want the source, you can always go to json.org. This is like the official website for JSON, and you can read more about it. So as I said, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. What JSON really is a collection of name-value pairs, or it's really a dictionary. Using a key, you can go in and get a value. And that value can be an object, it can be an array, it can be a number, it can be a Boolean, it can be a string, or it can be null. And JSON actually has its origins from JavaScript, so it closely resembles JavaScript syntax. And since it has its origins from JavaScript, the two go hand in hand, and they're really easy to use back and forth. In other languages, it's not quite as easy, and we'll explore that more when we get into Android. But luckily for us, we're starting with JavaScript, so it's going to be super easy. So here is our very first world example right here. We have an object, which inside of it has a name-value pair, and the data we're really representing here is the first name Bruce, and the real data is Bruce. And with JSON, every single piece of JSON that you'll look at will start with this curly brace or a square brace. And what that means is every single JSON example is either going to be an object or an array. And obviously inside of an object, you can have variables, you can have arrays, you can even have objects inside of objects, and we'll see an example of that. So as I mentioned right here, all of your JSON work needs to have a curly brace or a square brace. And the curly brace is what encapsulates the data into an object, and that's where the object part of JavaScript Object Notation comes from. Very key. So here we have our entire object, and here's our pair. Looking at this more in detail. And as we know, pairs have a name and a value. So the very first one, fname, is its name. And then we have the value Bruce. And what's important to note in JSON is that every single name needs to be a string. You have to have it inside of quotes. If I were to remove these quotes, we would have invalid JSON, However, this value right here can be several different data types. And as I said earlier, it can be a number, it can be a Boolean, it can be a string, it can be null, it can be an array, and it can be an object. So here we're blowing up the example a little bit more. And if you look at this, we have a few different types of data. We have our curly brace, which every single JSON example needs to start with, or a square brace. And what that means is we're starting out with an object. So this entire thing is an object. Looking inside that object, we have three variables. We have age, name, alive. And so here we're looking at the age, and its value is 21. Here we have name, and its value is Sandra D, and alive, false. So here we have a number, string, Boolean. Notice that the numbers and Booleans, they don't need quotes because they're not a string data type. Something that is important to note is that when you are listing name-value pairs, you need to separate them with a comma, except for the very last pair. So here we don't have a comma, which is okay. If you omit these commas, you're going to have invalid JSON. So here we have an example with an array. So here we have a pair with name scores, and its value is an array. We denote that by a square brace. And as you can see here, it's an array of numbers. So we can have an array of Booleans, an array of strings, an array of arrays, an array of objects. That's all fine and dandy. So as you know, an array is an ordered collection of values. It begins with the left bracket, square brace, whatever way you want to think about it, and each value is comma separated. So very important. Another way to visualize this example is you could, if this was the only piece of information you were going to return or exchange, you could just remove these curly braces and this name and just have this section right here, and this would also be valid JSON. So let's take a look at that, and I'll show you using my favorite tool, JSON lint. Gonna open it up, paste it in here, we're gonna hit validate, and it says this is valid JSON. And like I was saying, JSON, you can also just return an array. So maybe it's not important to give it a name. Maybe we're really just returning these numbers right here so we can remove this extraneous piece of information. So here, I'm going to need a square brace, and here we have an example, and let's see if this will work. Click validate, boom. This is also valid. So like I said, this is a good example of how you can return an array or an object. Both will work. All right, so that covers an array. Next, we have objects. An object is very similar to object-oriented programming. We can have just a single object. We can have objects inside of objects. So here with this example, we have an object which encapsulates this pizza object. You might be thinking, well, hey, maybe we could just remove this extraneous object and remove this name value pair and just have the entire thing represent a pizza. That's fine. You can do that if you want. But let's take a look inside this pizza object a little bit more. And as we can see here, we have 4 variables: name, ID, toppings, and price. Name is a string, the heart attack. ID is a number. Maybe this is used on the back end for processing this particular pizza. We list the toppings, and it's an array of strings. And we have a price, which is another number, 19.99. Very simple, easy to use. Now, we're going to kind of combine a bunch of the different data types, get a little more detail. So looking at this, once again, we have an entire object to encapsulate all of this information. We have a bunch of different pairs. We have type, document, it's a string. Next, we have students, which is a string array. Classroom, which is a number. Teach, string, full-time, Boolean. Pretty easy. And now I'm going to let you guys take a look at this example and dissect it yourselves. It's kind of similar to what we had before, but I threw in a tweak. So what I would like you guys to do is identify the number of objects, the number of arrays, and the other types of data that this example shows. So I'm going to give you a few seconds, and you can figure that out. Okay, so with what I come up with, I have found 4 objects, 1 array, and then 4 data types. So let's see if that's true. So here we have our encapsulating object, so that's 1 object. Now let's go find the other objects. Here we just have a string, nope. Here we have an array, nope. Here we have another string, number. Here we have another string, here we have another Boolean. Now let's step aside in this array, and as you can see here, we have an array of objects. And I have 1 index, 2 indices, 3 indices. So that's a total of 3 objects plus the encapsulating one, which is 4. So 4 objects. As I see here, I have a set of square braces, so that's 1 array. And then I have 4 different data types. One's a string, one's a number. We have 2 strings and 1 Boolean. So that's 4 objects, 1 array, 2 string data types, 1 number value, and 1 Boolean value. So say I give you some information and I want you using JavaScript to create a JSON object. That's very easy to do. All you need to do is create a JavaScript object, and there, boom, you got it. It's very simple. So using this data that I previously showed you back here, all we need to do is create a variable in JavaScript. So we say var class, and now we're creating an object. And to do that, all we do is have a curly brace. And inside of that, we start denoting the pieces of information that are associated with this object. So it's very simple. JavaScript, because it's very similar to JSON, almost interchangeable in this case, we can just start typing it out very easily. So since JavaScript objects are dictionaries, name value pairs as well, it's very easy to do this. No problem at all. So I've now created this JavaScript object. How do I actually access the data? Well, as I mentioned, JSON objects are just JavaScript objects, therefore it's easy to access these. All you need to do is use the name of the pair to access its value. So for example, if I wanted to access the type variable, all I would need to say is json.type, and that would return document. Extremely easy. Continuing on, what if I want to access the Tom object inside of this? All I need to do is say json.students, so I now have a handle to this array, and because I want to access a particular index, I do the sub 0. So now I'm accessing this very first indice, and that's going to return this object. But I want to get something inside of that object, so I say dot name. So that's going to return Tom. I want to get the age, json.students sub 0.age. Very easy. If I want to figure out how many students are in that array, well, we're just talking basic JavaScript here. And since it's an array, I can just use array.length to get its length. Nothing difficult. Something else that's important to note is using JavaScript, you can either use the dot notation or the named notation. So instead of using the dot, I can say in quotes right here with the square brace, the actual name value, and that will print out its value. So it's very easy to interchange these two and get what you need and want. You can finish off the rest of these. So you now have a JavaScript object, but you really want to send this to a server now. So you actually need to get a JSON string so you can bundle it up in your XML HTTP request and send it off. So how do I do that? Well, very easy once again with JavaScript. All you need to do is using this public JSON object, so that means it's accessible to every single developer, you just say json.stringify and pass in your JavaScript object, and it's going to convert that into a string for you. If you would like to take this JSON string and then convert it back into a JavaScript object, all you do is using the JSON global object, once again, say .parse, pass in your string, and boom, you have a JavaScript object. So to show you that, here I have an example which creates an object, converts it into JSON, and using that JSON string converts it back into a JavaScript object. Now this is rather pointless, but you can kind of just see how it works. So Once again, I'm going to create an object. So I just say var foo equals curly braces. Now I have a JavaScript object. Because you can dynamically create things on the fly, remember JavaScript's a weakly typed language. You can just go and do whatever you want. Start creating variables on the fly. I'm going to now say foo.bar equals something. So now I've added a variable to foo called bar, and its value is something. Once again, I'm going to do that once again, but instead of bar, I'm creating a variable named baz and setting it equal to 7. So now I have an object with two variables, bar and baz, and they both have values. And what I want to do is convert that into a string, a JSON string. So using the global JSON object, I call the stringify method and pass in my JavaScript object. It has to be an object. And I'm going to store that in a variable called JSON. But if I were to print this, we would see the output of JSON. So I'd see my object, because that's what I'm representing right here. And inside of it, I would see the name value pairs. So very easy to convert that object into a string. Now, once again, I'm going to take this string and put it back to what it originally was, which is a JavaScript object. Just using the global JSON.parse, I pass in that string. I'm going to set that equal to JSON. And so now I've overridden what was previously here, and I have an object. And I just access those values that I want. So I want to access bar here. Well, since it says something here, I'm going to print out something. Baz right here, it was 7, get 7. So very easy to do this, not difficult at all. So, because this is so easy, I want you guys to create a JS fiddle and actually go and access this JSON information that I have on the Lyle server. It's under my domain, so you guys can access it very easily. I've done it so it'll accept all requests from any server, so you can use the JSON fiddle if you need to. And what I want you to do is, using XML HT request, go and fetch this data, and what that's going to do is in the response text, it's going to have a JSON string. So you need to, using that response text, convert the string into an object, and then I want you to iterate all over the pairs and print out any pair whose name equals quantity. So something I would recommend first is, before you actually start doing all this work, let's actually take a look and see what this is pointing to. So I'm going to open it up, and as you can see here, it looks like it's a whole bunch of item menus. So it's not very readable. So what I would like to do is copy it and put it in JSON lint, and what JSON lint will do is pre-print it for us, so it'll be a lot easier to process. So click validate, and boom, we can see something much more readable. So here we have an object which inside of it has an array of drinks. So what we're looking at is drink information, and what it has inside of it is a name of a drink, its ID on the server. It has an image to represent this drink. It tells you the number of calories, the quantity that it has, and the units used to represent that quantity. So what I want you to do, if you look back right here, is I want you to go and fetch these drinks, and I want you to iterate all over the drinks array. And then I want you to print out the variable quantity for each drink object. So you need to go access this array, and then inside of each indice, print out this value right here. So that's going to be a part of the Blackboard quiz. I don't think this is too difficult. It's going to combine what we saw from the second video and what you've learned from this video. So I hope you guys learned a lot, and if you have any questions or need any help, let me know. Thanks. Bye.